Welcome to the 31st episode of the GameFor Podcast. In this episode, still recording from home, we'll be talking about tabletop indie games and how to get into them. I'm Adam.
I'm Matt.
And we're part of the GameFor Podcast. This podcast is all about building the community within tabletop gaming, whether it be board gaming, collectible card games, role-playing games, miniature games. And we want to teach you about gaming and help you get involved with the hobby because it's a great hobby to have. And let's see, what have we been doing since our last episode? We do these episodes every 2 weeks if you're new. We get things done in between episodes. What have you been doing, Matt?
Actually, I got a lot of hobbying going on. Baseball has wound down, and projects have been minimal. So I've been able to do a lot of assembly, putting together a lot of miniatures. I got my ball tanks from the Gaddis Gaming Kickstarter.
That was so fast. Like that Kickstarter got done. We had our stuff like in a month. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, I was kind of like, he told me like, well, it was going to ship really fast, but I still didn't. Like when the box showed up, I'm like,
yeah,
oh, okay. Yeah, especially because there was some stuff that got added on last minute, so I thought for sure that was going to delay, but nope, that was impressively fast. So yeah, I even got one assembled already.
Probably the fastest Kickstarter I've ever been a part of. So yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I got some of that done, some tanks and stuff like that. I also made my way into the game shop on Saturday for a free RPG day, and also it was also 40K release day, so that was kind of the perfect storm of busyness.
Yeah, no, between I was thinking about when we were talking with Steve Ellis on the podcast last episode about Free RPG Day, and he was like, "Oh, it's July 25th." I'm like, "Why do I know that date? Why do I know that date?" And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that's right. That's the date that the new stuff for the start of 9th edition Warhammer 40,000 comes out." So yeah, I bet it was busy at the store.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I also I was also able to get there's a really good Pathfinder Humble Bundle. I don't know if it's still going on. If it is, it's in the last few days, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But basically got like every single Pathfinder like books and modules and a bunch of other supplements, and even the actual physical copy of the book for like I think $30.
So they're going to actually mail you the book?
Yeah, I had to pay I think like $8 shipping and handling or something, but yeah, like that was, I mean, the book alone was cheaper than I was expecting. So yeah. So
that's very cool.
Yeah, between that and some of the stuff I found in the Free RPG Day handouts and stuff, I've got a lot of one-offs and some stuff coming along. So excited about that.
No,
and then cool. After watching your Twitch stream, or while watching your Twitch stream last night, I finally got back into painting. I haven't painted. It's been a few months since I had torn everything kind of apart and put stuff away for renovations in the man cave. So yeah, finally got back and got my Reaper owlbear painted up. So,
oh, cool! Yeah. Was it a Reaper one, or is it the WizKids one?
No, it's a Reaper one. So I had primed it before, and like the last time I did like a large batch of anything that wasn't primed, but it was just sitting there, and I'm like, oh, it had like a little bit done. I think I started painting it a little bit when I was teaching my two youngest kids to paint, but because I was mainly helping them out, I didn't make much progress. So yeah, I was able to get that painted pretty quickly last night.
Nice,
at least tabletop ready. So.
Well, and if it's like the model that I'm thinking of, generally, there's a lot of like feathers. Anytime there's a creature with a bunch of feathers or fur, you can do a bunch of dry brushing, and that helps you speed things along and just cover area. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah, and I was using the contrast, which I think are perfect for D&D minis.
Yep. Yeah. Citadel contrast paints are good for that stuff too. Yeah.
There was a lot of fur being painted. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. With that owlbear, is it fur or feathers?
There's both.
Oh, all right.
So it's kind of like there's feathers sticking out from underneath the fur.
That makes sense, I guess.
I kept them mostly the same, some off a little bit, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I might go back and detail it a little bit more, but it's at least good enough to put out on the table now. So
Yeah, that's always kind of a later step. When you've got a creature like that, you go back and detail like after. That makes sense.
yeah, and I don't think there'll be a table anytime soon. So
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm not in a huge rush.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, actually,
How about you?
hopefully once we come out of all of this, a bunch of us are going to just have a lot of finished miniatures. I know I will. Yeah,
it's gonna be like Christmas morning.
Yeah, just about. No, I've been keeping busy. I've started, as I've mentioned in the past, a couple episodes. I've been streaming more on Twitch, and this past weekend I streamed on Friday and Saturday for San Diego Comic-Con at home. And I worked with the folks from Board Game Geek on that. I've been kind of working with them, and they've been doing content for different conventions. San Diego Comic-Con at home was one of them. And then this upcoming Friday and Saturday, I'm also streaming again and teaching people how to paint some kind of board game miniatures. And I'm doing it's going to be for Gen Con online. So,
Nice.
That'll be on Friday and Saturday.
You're on the official Twitch, or like you do it on your Twitch and they cross stream it, or how does that work?
So it's at least with San Diego Comic-Con, I was doing it on my Twitch, and then Board Game Geek has I think it's boardgamegeek.com/live that they just have basically like a window where they then embed the content, and then that gets referenced. So people who are at San Diego Comic-Con going through, obviously they're not at it, but they're at the website. They get to go through and look at what's going on, and then they follow links. I'm not exactly sure how it works. I just know that a lot more people show up than usual when I do those. So I know people are coming from somewhere. So
nice.
Yeah, I don't know this upcoming week. I don't know. I might be actually having to stream directly to a different account rather than mine, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm still kind of up in the air on that. And then, or is that, I don't know, there's a couple other shows possibly coming up this year as well, that working with the folks at Board Game Geek, and I might be doing some of those as well. And maybe one of those is where I have to stream differently. So like everybody kind of does it a bit differently, but it's basically me.
I'm guessing there's a lot of figuring out still. People are trying to see what works best. So
still scrambling in a lot of different ways. But yeah, this past weekend I painted the 4 models from the new Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion set. So the idea behind these things where I'm working with the folks from Board Game Geek is basically kind of trying to teach board gamers who are interested in painting their miniatures but don't know if they can do it. I'm trying to show them, yeah, you can, and here's some simple techniques, and this is the kind of
right
look.
Because like 10 years ago. Yeah, 10 years ago, board gamers were pretty much, it was meeples or nothing.
Right. And now, I mean, just about every board game is going to come with a bunch of different miniatures. And I mean, like this, the Gloomhaven box, that Jaws of the Lion, like it only came with 4 miniatures. There's only 4 miniatures in there. So I kind of got to spend a little bit more time sort of working on them and things like that. But I didn't go crazy. And honestly, sometimes the models that are in board games are not super great, like detail. So it's sort of harder to get in there and get real fancy with the paint because there's kind of nothing to work off of a little bit. But these models weren't too bad. A couple of them were better than others. And so yeah, I was just basically kind of teaching people some quick techniques and things like that, and going through on Friday and Saturday and painting them those models up. And I'll be doing, like I said, I'll be doing Gen Con this upcoming weekend. I think it'll start 9 a.m. on Central Time on both Friday and Saturday. And I'm going to be painting, there's 4 models from an expansion to the game Wildlands by Osprey.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And those are great models. At least the originals were.
Well, the ones, because you've seen these. They came in that extra small box. There was the original box, and then there was the one, and it was called the Unquiet Dead. And there was like a skeleton archer, and like they were all like basically skeleton-y kind of undead, but like not real super skinny. I don't know. They were really cool looking. So I'm looking forward to painting those. I'm going to be priming them maybe tomorrow night, and then they'll be ready for Friday morning. So I'm going to be doing kind of the same technique that I did with those Gloomhaven models, where I'm going to do a Zenithal Prime or a Zenithal highlight. But I'm not going to use a spray. I'm going to use a big dry brush. So, which actually worked pretty well, for people who don't either have both a black primer and a white primer, or people who don't have an airbrush, being able to use that big makeup brush, a big fluffy makeup brush, actually worked out pretty well. So yeah, I'm gonna
When
do
I
that
saw
again.
some of your Twitch lately with it, I've got one, but I've only kind of used it a little bit on terrain. I hadn't used it on any people yet, and I was shocked at how well it was working out.
Yeah, I actually just literally this morning I ordered like 4 more from Amazon because I kind of don't want to go to Walmart right now. So I just was like, oh look, they're on Amazon, cool, and so they should show up I think Friday or Saturday.
And get them before like everybody at Gen Con suddenly now wants to buy makeup brushes.
Well, there's that too. Yeah. To be fair, there's a limit of 3. You can only buy 3 of them. I was like, because I'm like, well, heck, I'll just buy like I don't know 10 of them because they were like $5, and they would only let me buy 3. So I was like, all right. So anyway.
they're already preparing.
Exactly. They know. But then otherwise, I've been also working just sort of on a me project instead of stuff that I'm streaming. I'm painting a resin, like a 3D printed Yeti from Titan Forge. They're a company out of Poland, and they have what do you call it, a Patreon. And every month, like you pay them, I think it's like $10, and then you get, I don't know, something like 30 or 35 different STL files for 3D printing.
Oh, wow. That's like one a day.
Holy and it's basically, it's like I said, it's like $10. And a lot of companies are starting to do this now. A lot of groups who have been doing 3D sculpture, in the computer are just doing this now where they're like, we're going to do a Patreon and you pay $8 to $10 a month and you get access to everything. And then like a couple months later, we take all those files and we put them out either on our website or there's a website called My Mini Factory or something like that, where you can go. And it's not like Thingiverse where stuff is free, but you have to pay for it. But then you can buy stuff a la carte later if you don't want to do the Patreon.
I actually got a discount, 10% discount. Had never been on that website before until yesterday.
Oh, wow,
because I got a 10% coupon code with my resin printer, and it runs out on the end of this month. And I'm like, oh, I need to check this out. I thought it was just like for resin or whatever. So I went and looked. I'm like, oh wow, yeah, there was some spectacular models on there.
Oh yeah, they get some really, really nice stuff. And so this Yeti was really nice. It was just 2 pieces. I had my friend, this is before you had your resin printer, but I had my friend Mac the Maker, who you also know. He lives out in Arizona now, and so I had him print it and then mail it to me, and I paid him and stuff. And so it's a cool model, and I'm I primed him white obviously because he's a Yeti, and now I'm doing some work to him and a little bit of dry brushing, kind of like your owlbear and stuff like that. So just basically kind of doing it for fun. And I don't know if I'll use them in a game particularly. Can't think of a lot of games I play with Yetis, but it's something. It's just sort of a fun project. And then actually last night, Monday night, I streamed on Twitch because I've been doing it. Basically, my normal standard these days is Friday morning and Monday after dinner, so like around 7 p.m. And so last night I started streaming on a new project after those Necrons that I worked on for a long time. Those Necrons came in that new starter box from 40K that came out when you were at Free RPG Day. So now I am painting 13 Skaven plague monks. Skaven are kind of like big giant rat people, sort of, except they're small because they're rats, but they're way bigger than regular rats, and they're kind of bipedal and can carry swords. And so the Skaven plague monks, I'm using those for Warcry, which is kind of like Kill Team is to 40K. Warcry is to Age of Sigmar. So it's like the fantasy kind of skirmishy sort of fun game that comes from Games Workshop. And so, those 13 plague monks are going to become a warband for that. And I'll be painting on them the next... Well, again, I won't be able to paint on this weekend because I'm doing stuff for Gen Con Online, but I'll paint them next Monday and then going forward until they're finished. But I got a good start on them last night. So
very cool. I watched. I watched quite a bit. I don't know how late you were out, but I think right around the time where you're 10. Like, oh, okay, yeah. So you said you were like, oh, it's already like 9:30. I'm like, oh crap, it's 9:30. I need to.
Yeah. So it's been fun. I've been really enjoying the streaming stuff. So it's been going well. But otherwise, I've gone back into the mode where I don't really particularly clean the basement as much as I ought to, but I'm trying to get a little better at that. It's just that lately the weekends have been so crazy because of this weekend and next weekend with doing stuff with the Board Game Geek folks for the different virtual conventions. That kind of takes a bunch of time. Well, takes a decent amount of time, but I'm going to try this upcoming weekend also to do a little bit more down in the basement. So, moving things around and trying to, I don't know, just get rid of stuff. That's also helpful too. But yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. So we're talking today, and it's kind of the opposite of trying to get rid of stuff. It's actually looking into new things. Yeah. But, still, they're generally, in many situations, they're smaller, come in smaller boxes, if they even come in boxes at all. But they're indie games. Now, it's interesting. When I first started searching for the term indie board games as an example, the first thing that popped up was Settlers of Catan and like Ticket to Ride and stuff like that. Which, if you're amongst the world of like us, hobby gamers, those aren't indie because those are like some of the biggest in the industry. But if you're just a regular, for lack of a better word, normie, indie games are anything that's not like Monopoly, you know what I mean? Like, or stuff like that. So
like they've kind of taken like what used to be called like a Euro game and just kind of give it that.
At least in the articles that first popped up when I started doing that Google search, right?
I could see that, yeah.
From a mainstream perspective, yes, I would say that the games that we enjoy, the Euro games, and the things that aren't Monopoly, Life, Sorry, that kind of stuff, Trouble. Those, these are independent games to some degree because they're not made by Parker Brothers or Hasbro or whatever. Although some of them are technically owned by Hasbro, but what we're talking about is the games that are not even made by companies like, Asmodee or, that kind of stuff. We're talking about, in many situations, indie games are, one-person operations, maybe two-person operations.
Right. They're basically doing everything in-house and for themselves, but a very, very, very small team, if there's even a team.
Yeah. And very frequently, it's maybe like a person who's kind of running the show, and then some contractors, like freelance, illustrators, maybe somebody to help with rules design, stuff like that. But yeah, those were indie games, and they don't get a lot of marketing, if they have any marketing at all. A lot of them, although it's interesting though, as we're getting further and further into the game industry, and we're getting more and more as we move along down the road of time, in this day and age, it is becoming almost difficult sometimes to tell an indie game from a game sold by a big company because of the technology that we have access to, digital full color printing, and like Kickstarter and stuff like that. Like, you can be a single person, and if you've got a good enough concept and a good enough idea, you could raise enough money on Kickstarter to pay for a whole bunch of artists and layout people and fancy plastics and all kinds of stuff like that.
Absolutely,
it can happen. And then that end product, you can look at it, and it would be basically difficult to tell it apart from something made by a whole team of folks.
Absolutely, yeah. It's definitely becoming more interspersed of what it is and what it's not, and it's not a piece of paper that's been photocopied and put into a little Ziploc bag.
Right. Which is the stuff that I remember and sometimes reminisce about, frankly, a little bit. Like, I remember back in the days when Gen Con was still in Milwaukee, I remember going to the Game Science booth. You remember Game Science? The guy who makes the really super sharp dice. Have you been by that booth? It's an older gentleman named Lou Zoki. And he invented the 100-sided die. The dice that he sells are always super crazy sharp because he doesn't like normal polyhedral dice that we use in this industry. Your 8-siders, your 10-siders, your 12-siders, and all that stuff. They normally get tumbled in a machine, almost like a rock tumbler, and that's how they get their rounded edges. But in doing that, they can become slightly uneven, which means they
less precise. Yeah,
exactly. So they could be technically slightly more favored to roll to one number versus another over thousands and thousands of rolls. Well,
CRPGers, there are dice that are just roll bad.
It's true. It's totally true. But these, so these dice are always they're never tumbled, so they're very sharp. And anyway, he also used to sell a role-playing game, a super simple role-playing game called Torps that came in a Ziploc bag. And it was a black and white cover, but it had usually colored cardstock. And then it was a real small size. It was I don't know, 5x7 roughly size or something like that, and in these bigger kind of Ziploc bags. I used to love buying them and like going through them and stuff like that. So those types of indie games, like that's what I think of when I think of indie game. Like these were probably, back in the day they were made at Kinko's, and then and hand put together and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So yeah, and that's kind of where I cut my teeth, to honestly, like when when my friend Peter and I started a little mini kind of hobby game company while we were still in college, and Snarling Badger Games, and like our very first product, we went to Kinko's and cranked out 25 copies or something like that, or 24 copies, and took it to Gen Con to sell it to people there. And it was again photocopied and all that kind of stuff. But nowadays it's not only, the photocopying is not even necessary if you're getting into PDF stuff, and then you can easily ship it basically for free because it's not shipped. It's just like emailed or whatever to people all over the world when you're not even awake.
Right.
And it's a very different time.
QR codes and yeah.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So it's really cool. And because of this, we've seen an explosion of indie games in all of the different genres, all four of what we consider the different genres. So yeah. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about board games, kind of to start? I don't know. Like, I think that indie board games, it's a fine line, kind of for the reasons that we said, because you can have a game that looks just as good as a game made by a huge group in some situations, but it can be made by a much smaller group just because the technology is available and all that kind of stuff.
Right. But
yeah.
I think almost all indie board games are like either are coming out of Kickstarter or they're getting ready to go to Kickstarter. It seems like, I don't know if there's many that are being sold and there's like no Kickstarter or some kind of group fundraising that's not in the plan.
Yeah. If it's a game where you're buying it directly and getting a copy like that, yes, I think you're right. There's pretty much nobody out there anymore who's just going to sit down and produce 1,000 to 10,000 copies of a game that they made completely by themselves and got printed, and like, because where are you going to get the money for that and all that kind of stuff? Who knows if you're going to end up sitting with a garage full of it? So yeah, you're right. When people are going that direction, you're seeing a lot of it. But we're also seeing another good place to find indie board games that doesn't require that kind of work is stuff like where they're print on demand. So like the Game Crafter, actually also out of Wisconsin, like we are down in the southern part of the state. The Game Crafter started out, I remember when they first started, and like they could print in color on some stuff, but like their boxes still were like just black and white. It was like a black and white sticker that was stuck to like a white corrugated box, like a clamshell style box. And, they had X amount of different types of meeples and some different parts and stuff like that. And now, in many situations, games from the Game Crafter will look, again, nearly like regular product that you would buy at the game store, because they'll have completely, art wrapped boxes or tuck boxes. If it's a card game, the cards look printed as opposed to say digitally printed. At this point, day and age, it's hard to tell the difference. Look at like Keyforge. Like those cards have got to be digitally printed because they're all different.
Right.
So,
yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's now the technology has become more available to everybody. It's really the skills of the team and the work put into the team versus what is available.
Yeah,
they don't need $2 million machines to do that stuff. So yeah, it definitely helps out. And then companies like the Game Crafter, bring even more stuff to
Well, and the benefit there for the Game Crafter, for using the Game Crafter, in my opinion, is that it is allowing you to, because it's print on demand, there's no upfront cost. You're not going to a manufacturer and getting 1,000 or 10,000 of these things made. You're spending the time to do all that stuff. You're writing all the, you're making all the files, and you're uploading all the artwork, and you're doing all that stuff. And then if nobody ever buys one, you're not out any money. Or if 3 people buy it, you're still not out any money. And the thing that's interesting is you can find all kinds of crazy, interesting indie stuff on something like the Game Crafter, but there's also games that have started at the Game Crafter that have then eventually gone into like the real world. I know for one, Let's Roll which is now being produced by or published by Calliope Games. That's a game that
Mm-hmm.
I've played with my in-laws. It's like a dice game and stuff like that. And that started at GameCrafter. I think maybe the Captain is Dead might have started at GameCrafter. I'm not 100%
Yeah,
sure
that did.
on
Yeah,
that.
I'm
Did it?
pretty sure that
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
So yeah, if you're looking for board games these days, in my opinion, a good place to find indie board games is to take a look at the Game Crafter. And
Mm-hmm.
admittedly, there is chaff there. There is a lot of stuff that you're just kind of like, nah, I don't know if this is my thing. But there's other things that can be very specific that might be exactly your thing.
Right, exactly. Like there might be 30 things that you don't care about, but there might be because there's so many different variety on themes or mechanics that,
Oh yeah,
especially if you have something that you're like, oh, I really wish there was a game like X, there's probably that X there already.
mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then another place that I found actually a bunch of information about a lot of smaller indie board games, mainly through interviews with the designers, is a podcast called the Indie Board Game Designers Podcast. And they've got, I don't know, 140 some different episodes, and they talk to a different person every episode. And so, yeah, just kind of even scrolling back through the website and looking at like, what did this person design? What did this person design? And I've actually found a bunch of interesting stuff that way. And there was one actually that I found that I was like, oh, that's very cool. And they did their stuff through GameCrafter. And then after I did a little bit of Google research, it turns out they had started through GameCrafter, but now they were going through Atlas Games. So they had, again, gotten picked up by an actual, full-blown publisher and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, it's really, I think the game was called Breakdancing Meeples, I think is what it was called. But yeah, Atlas Games. So again, it's one of those situations where, the indie stuff can kind of start getting picked up by the bigger publishers, but it still gives you that ability to be able to do that. It's almost like in music. You ever heard of Bandcamp?
Yes.
Yeah. So Bandcamp, like the website, like I feel a little bit almost like Bandcamp is a little bit like GameCrafter, you know what I mean? Or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, so it's just very interesting to kind of, because there's a lot of weird stuff on Bandcamp too that maybe you're not interested in, but there might be the exact same thing that you're really looking for that you can't find at, Sam Goody. Is Sam Goody even around anymore? I don't even think do we have malls? I don't remember.
If there is still,
can you go outside anymore?
I don't know. It might be like Blockbuster. Like there's just one that's basically just a museum almost.
Yeah, it could be that. But
Gather
so
around,
like,
folks.
Yeah, I mean, like the downside to some degrees, if you're into board games that have super high production values, lots and lots and lots of fancy miniatures, like let's say Zombicide comes with a lot of miniatures, or Scythe, or something like that, you're gonna it's harder to do that obviously for the indie folks. But if you're looking for games that can be played with meeples and cubes, and honestly, GameCrafter does have a lot of different things you can put in those boxes now. So,
right.
and they keep adding more things all the time.
For a mechanic and a general theme, that's kind of, you're not probably going to get, 50 minis. But then again, you might, as 3D printers become more common, you're going to start getting, where you can print on demand that stuff as well. So,
and we'll talk a little bit about this when we get to talking about war games, but I could see at some point somebody who makes a board game that, sells it on, let's say, GameCrafter, and you buy the book and the board and a lot of the parts. And then they're also like, also, if you have a resin printer or a friend with a resin printer, you can print these minis to replace these wood blocks to make them look fancier, and you can get that for free here, or there's a QR code or whatever the deal is, so that you now get access to that as well. But if you don't, you've got something to, maybe a chip, maybe you've got a token. It's like, hey, this is the token of the bad guy or whatever, then you can move around the board. But if you want to print one in 3D, we have one designed, and you could grab that and then print that, and whatever. So I think you're going to see more of that if that's not already happening. I honestly think it would be weird if it wasn't already happening, but it's probably, if not, It's coming soon. Yeah. As far as like the benefits, again, there's really, they're not safe for choices sometimes, so you can really find interesting new mechanics and themes like we were talking about. It's not just the stuff where they're looking at it from the aspect of like, well, what's going to sell, you know what I mean?
Right. They're less concerned about the marketing. It's more of somebody had an idea, somebody had an itch, and then they were creative and came up with that.
Yeah.
But it can be like the poetry night at the the coffee shop. there might be a lot of rough gems out there.
That's a very good point. Yes, that's a good. And then, like, what kind of drawbacks do you see for indie board games generally?
I mean, well, you've got, usually it's one person doing everything, so they might have like, they're really good at math or game theory, so like the balance is spot on, but maybe the theme is really lacking, or they're
Sure.
they're a great artist, or they're not a great artist and they can't find anyone to draw. So usually you'll find it where like it really excels at maybe the one area that they're good at. Maybe there's even a few areas, but you usually don't see kind of across the entire game as being fully polished. And
yeah, that's a good point. There's very few people that I can think of who are really just like a one person, force to be reckoned with. There's somebody usually who's like, oh, I'm good at this, but I'm not good at the layout, or I'm not good at the art, or maybe I'm good at art and layout, but I'm kind of terrible at game design and everything comes across a little unbalanced or whatever. But the concept was very cool, and so that's why generally, if you can, as the team kind of grows a little bit, you kind of start to cover all those bases. But then as the team grows, it becomes a little bit less indie in a lot of situations too. So yeah. And like what other kind of, like other drawbacks as far as like board games and stuff?
Like you're probably, it's probably not going to have, expansions and it might, it might not be around forever. The person might pull it off. So, there might be a game that you really enjoyed and, something happens to it and there's no way to replace it,
Sure. No, that's true too. I mean, and like, again, like I said, sometimes the game, if it's really good and you got it from, say, somebody online and then some other company like becomes the publisher, you're probably not going to be able to get that game online, the original version anymore. You can only get the publisher version. You know what I mean? Which can frequently cost more, or many times it's a benefit. Let's not say that publishers are bad. Many times that they come along and have resources to throw at it. But sometimes
it's it's like having editors, for authors too. I mean, you can read stuff that people post directly, but sometimes there's a benefit to that polish and second set of eyes and the market, knowing that stuff. But then again, sometimes a publishers won't publish stuff they don't think has a market to sell to, so you don't get some of this stuff.
No, that's very true. Yeah. So what about indie RPGs? Like we around the GameFor ranch kind of refer to, there are 4 separate different types of genres within tabletop gaming. You've got your board games, you've got your RPGs, you've got your CCGs, your collectible card games, and then of course your war games / miniatures and whatnot. And so after, we've talked about indie board games, but indie RPGs, I think, and you probably are going to back me up on this a bit to a degree, I think that they have even more potential for indiness just because
absolutely,
they don't need as much stuff.
Right, you're not designing a board game and possibly miniatures or pieces and all that
and
stuff.
A box.
Right. It's generally just a PDF with rules and it's everybody's imagination. So,
or maybe a book. I mean, you might do an actual book or even just a print on demand book, but it can be done literally with a PDF in many situations. A lot of RPG folks are playing off of PDFs.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's, and then, it's almost like fan fiction for some stuff. Like if you're even doing it inside other worlds, like if you're doing it in kind of like a D&D 5e rules, you don't have to, you could still build your own universe using that rule set. And then, there's compatibility stickers and stuff that you can just basically throw on your thing and everyone knows that, oh, I don't have to learn new rule sets, but here's a new way to play this game.
Right. Well, and there are even people who are making like modules that are not module. Module gets into D&D quite a bit, but they're making source books, which are basically just a lot of information for the GM to be able to take and to put into any system that they're already using.
Absolutely, I mean? Then they could do everything. They could be like, oh, I really like King Arthur, and I want to build a thing all around that. But I don't want to have to come up with how everybody's going to fight and stuff, fight mechanics and everything. So I'm just going to use all this, but then give you all of the rules of that setting of what magic is allowed, what magic is not, or
and like the source books.
Creatures.
the source books aren't going to have like the perfect stats for the system necessarily that you are using as the DM, but you can just be like, okay, well, this creature is kind of like this creature from this system, so I'll just say it's basically, or you can tweak it a little bit. I mean, that's the whole thing that's great about tabletop games is the customization. But yeah, there's a lot of people out there who are doing that, and there are also people out there who are, I mean, I know that D&D used to have a license thing where you used to be able to like make stuff for, I know it was more for like what they called a D20 system back in the day, and you could like legally make and sell products for the D20 system. I don't know if that still goes on in 5th edition. Do you know if that's still a thing?
I mean, I know that people do it on like Drive Through RPG and DM's Guild, and it's got some of the artwork from Wizards there, so that the covers kind of look compatible and everything. So I'm assuming, based on
There
just
must be
what I
some
know
sort of
about,
licensing.
yeah, with how adamant IP is nowadays with intellectual
Yeah.
property, I would imagine there's got to be something kind of going on there that some kind of rule of what you're allowed to use and not use. So
Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, so I mean, and there are like, so the issue, I guess, is like that there are a lot of them out there, and they can be, again, something just as simple as a source book that you use with whatever mechanics that you're already using. They can be add-ons to systems that you're already using, and they can also be completely full-blown systems, all the way from small kind of one-time play, sort of like, like it's not like it's not a campaign. It's like a one-time session where you play like one night, all the way
right,
up to big sessions that you play for a long time. Like are you guys still playing Lancer?
We have not played in a little while. I would say ever since COVID hit, but yeah, that one. It's almost outside. It's almost grown out of the indie label, I would say, at this point now. But yeah, that was that's a great one for that, which is super immersive. I mean, they have their own tool system and everything for that now.
Yeah.
But then you've got like something like Honey Heist, where you're playing a bear, and it's just a quick one little thing. It's kind of meant to be fun and not very serious.
Like a one shot is what they call those frequently.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
like then I've got one that I've been that's still kind of in early rules stages. Dark Era RPG that I like. That one's kind of got like a X-Files type feel to it, where basically
Oh
like
yeah. Yep.
like aliens are real. There's definitely hidden and dark conspiracies in the government, and then there's the clueless individuals where stuff is going around them. And what I really like about what they're doing is that they've kind of got like 3 ages that you can play in. So you've got like a 50s 60s era that you can kind of do like a nostalgic like Area 51, and everybody's driving classic cars, and
Sure.
everyone, the agents are all dressed in to the nines in suits working for Hoover. Or you can do like one that's kind of takes place now, kind of modern. And then I believe there's also kind of a future with one. I think at that point it might become more general knowledge that aliens are there, and it might be more you're kind of fighting against it more actively. But yeah, it's kind of got the different eras, which I think are really kind of cool, that because you can there's some it's really giving the game master kind of freedom to do a lot of stuff. Like maybe you start a campaign and then their children take on the crusade, but maybe they don't realize that that's their children when they first start out, kind of like Mulder
Yeah.
found out about all of his stuff that his dad had done, and been involved with.
Yeah.
You can kind of do like a generational thing, or you could do maybe where they're hopping through time or something. I don't know.
No, that'd be very cool. Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, and so like there's like, I think with RPGs, honestly, RPGs of the 4 genres, RPGs I think might be the easiest to get into if you're interested in getting into indie games. And by easiest, I mean both from the developer standpoint, like if you wanted to start making indie RPGs, I think that if you want to start making indie games, indie RPGs might be the easier ones to make to some degree. And also as a person, it's very simple to maybe sometimes you find add-ons and indie stuff that's free. Sometimes it's maybe, relatively inexpensive. And again, because a lot of times it's also PDFs, it's not like you've got to store, pounds and pounds and pounds of books. You can just kind of, I've got an iPad that's full of all kinds of stuff like that. And
right.
It
or even
way any more than it did before. So
yeah, I've been using drive-through, so I don't even have to keep everything on my computer. I can just download what I want. So I'm, and leave stuff up there that I'm not using. I'm also on, like, if you do some newsletters, like I believe DM's Guild is the one, like, it used to be Mondays, but I think it's shifted now to Tuesdays. I get like a free supplement every week of something that they're promoting. That they still ask for you to kind of, if you do end up liking it, to go back and pay for it, but
sure.
But there's stuff that I'm like, oh well, I wouldn't probably have checked this out, but yeah, I'll try that out, I'll see what that is. And so there's even like the free to try stuff on there. And
yeah. And so Drive-Through RPG is probably one of the biggest, like, online sellers of indie RPGs and things like that. I'm assuming. Is there anybody that you can think of that's more well known or anything along those lines?
Probably not more well known, but I mean, it's definitely becoming more popular. I mean, free RPG Day this year, they actually had a booklet that was just filled with, I think I lost count, but I think there was like 15 different RPGs in that single book. So I mean, it seems like you can find them everywhere now.
Sure, yeah, that's true. But yeah, so like,
some
Drive Through
free.
RPG
I mean, like
is
Honey Heist is free, and you can just download that.
Yeah, but they're generally PDF, but sometimes they are even formatted so that if you wanted to, you could get them print on demand. Like Drive Through RPG does that as well, because some people prefer just a physical book. And you're going to get, I think, a soft cover. I don't know if Drive Through RPG does hardcovers or not.
I believe they do hardcovers now. I'm almost positive on that. Yeah. And maybe it's like a certain level you have to do for that, but I want to say that there's even hardcovers.
Because I know that, like, it's partially dependent upon the person who's putting up the files, because the files have to be slightly different when they're going into a book versus just a regular PDF. And so I think that you've got some companies out there, some groups, some persons, who are just, again, one person bands who are just like, I'm just going to put it up as a PDF. People can buy it for cheap and I'll make a little bit of money and it'll be great. And then there's other people who are maybe a little bit either more serious, or they just have more skills in layout and design and stuff like that, and they can put up both and then kind of reap those benefits as well. But yeah, it's not just, I'm just going to get a bunch of PDFs. You can also get a lot of these in many situations also in some sort of print version, if that's what you're really into, which I think is very cool for those types of things. What kind of drawback is there for indie RPGs, you think?
Usually you're gonna have a hard time. Like, you're not gonna be able to, like, walk into a game store and just be like, throw it down on the table, like, okay, we're playing this.
Sure.
So your community is definitely smaller, or you're probably gonna have to explain the rules to everybody you play with, yourself. So you're really gonna have to be that ambassador if you want to play those games. Which, with RPGs, you usually don't play solo. So you are going to be having to teach more people that, and and try to get people to want to do that. Also, you're probably going to have less online tool support. Like a lot of the big ones, Pathfinder, D&D, you're starting to get character sheets are built online. Your character generation, character tracking, modules, maps, fights, dice rolling, all that stuff is becoming more and more accessible. So you're going to kind of lose some of that stuff, which might be a little bit harder, especially right now when a lot of us are still kind of locked in.
Certainly, yeah, that's true too, I suppose. I mean, there's always probably a Discord server somewhere, even for nearly any kind of indie style RPG, where people might get together and play, because Discord servers can be basically free, and it's just kind of again, we've got a bunch of tools now that make it a lot easier. So that's very cool. But yeah, you're right. You're not going to see like a D&D Beyond type thing, for every game that's out there. You're only going to see it for some of the biggest. So
right.
Yeah, that's very interesting. As far as like indie war games and miniatures and things like that, again, you're looking at a lot of like 1-person, 2-person sort of operations. But there are still there's a decent amount out there to choose from, and I would say that like one of the best places to go look is wargamevault.com, which is actually part of DriveThruRPG. It's basically the same company. It's just that they also have a version that is not RPG based. It's more aiming towards like wargaming and stuff like that. But again, it's the same kind of deal. Some of them are PDF only. Some of them can also be bought as print on demand and all that stuff, so you can actually get a physical book. And a lot of them are just like all indie games. A lot of them, they don't have the greatest artwork. They don't have like super fancy, art and layout, like let's say a Games Workshop style game does. But the thing I think that's kind of cool too is that, I don't know, there's just a lot of different options and a lot of different things you can choose from. Lately, my 2 favorites for indie miniature games, indie war games, are something called Planet 28 by a guy named Nick Evans over in the UK. And then Star Breach, which is by Elijah Kellogg, who is based out of the US. And so like Star Breach, you can go to the Star Breach website and download the rules for free. If you want the kind of slightly more expanded or fancier rules with like more artwork and some more scenarios and stuff like that, then you pay, I think it's maybe $10. And then there's also a book you can buy, like an actual soft cover type book. Planet 28 is Planet 28 is super cheap. You get it through Wargame downloads, and it's a PDF. But you can also buy a tiny little book from the actual designer, who will then ship it to you from the UK. It's like 16 pages, and it's like a 5x7 little booklet. It's not even, it's not like a full size book, but it's a real small little thing. But it's just sort of nice to have. I generally work off of the PDF, but both of those games I like because they're small skirmish sci-fi. They've just got some sort of charm to them. They've got some mechanics, some game mechanics that I really like. And for me personally, the thing that I've been getting into lately is also a lot of kit bashing, which is like basically taking models and kind of like taking the head from this thing and putting it on this guy, and giving this guy a different gun or giving this person a different whatever robot arm, and it's yeah, you're just putting these models together in ways that they're not supposed to normally be done, and that way, because none of the thing about these games in almost every situation is they don't have a model line. They don't have, you know what I mean? Like,
that's what I was wondering. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're like, playing Warhammer 40,000 or Age of Sigmar from Games Workshop, you generally play with the models that they sell. You don't have to, but if you're going to start playing competitively and going to tournaments, you do have to. You have to be using their models. But when you
even
and your
like
friends
the base sizes are sometimes
in many situations, the certain base sizes, for the models, this model is supposed to have a base of this size and things like that and whatever. But with games like basically a lot of other indie games, generally they don't. Not all of them. So actually, some of them do, but it's pretty rare. Most situations, they're more along the lines of something known as miniatures agnostic. So just use whatever models you like. I mean, Star Breach, if you look at the different armies in the back of the book for Star Breach that you can choose from, you start reading some of the army lists, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, these are supposed to be Imperial Guard from 40K. And they don't call them Imperial Guard, but if you know Imperial Guard, you're reading it. And what that's doing is it's saying, hey, if you've got Imperial Guard models, you can just use them in this thing. But then they've also got like another one where you're looking at it and you're like, oh, these are basically stormtroopers and Sith and stuff like that. And I get that. So if you're using those models, you could use that. But there's also armies in the back of the book that are like just generic space pirates or, rebels and stuff like that. So they don't have like a direct correlation to some other company's stuff. So you get a lot of choices, which is nice.
Now, do you have to worry about like scale on all of those, or just some of them? Or
in general, most of the games are aimed towards the more 28 millimeter kind of standard scale, which is the same as like games like, Age of Sigmar, Warhammer 40,000, Malifaux, stuff like that. But you can. The thing that's interesting is about those games too is that some of them will also be like, but if you're interested in playing in 15 millimeter scale, which is also a relatively, it's not nearly as well known as 28 millimeter scale.
That's more for like historical. It's like 15, I think.
Sometimes, yeah. But there are some people who do like 15 millimeter because they're just smaller and easier to store and cheaper to buy and stuff like that. And the terrain, everything gets scaled down. Then the terrain gets scaled down. You're playing on a smaller table, all that jazz. And then what they tell you to do is just generally translate all of the inch measurements into centimeters. And then that's just your quick and easy
Oh,
just
okay, yeah,
split, because so yeah. So that's not a bad idea either. Again, like the benefits are like, again, these types of games are generally cheaper because you're usually either printing your own or you're working from a PDF. Sometimes they do have print on demand versions if you want to go that way. Again, like I said, they're it's nice. I really like the fact that I can play with the models that I want to play, because there's plenty of models sometimes I look at and I'm like, I love those models, but I don't like the game they're attached to, or I don't like the
yeah,
army, or whatever, but I like those models. So now you've got a reason to buy those models, build them, and do cool stuff with them and play them in different games, which
right,
I think
yeah,
is
because
a lot
like
of fun.
yeah, being at conventions, like I'm like, oh, Malifaux has some really cool models I'd love to paint up, but I'm not
Hmm.
sure I really want to play Malifaux. Nothing wrong with Malifaux. I just
Sure, yeah, yeah.
not sure I want to deep dive into that. But yeah, it'd be cool to be able to kind of throw them into something. And
And there's times when you're like, this is maybe even a cool game potentially, but I don't know where it plays it, so it's kind of a hard thing. But I do really love yeah, the last Malifaux model I bought just because it was super cool, and I'm going to use it for something eventually. But I'm not going to use it for probably for Malifaux, just because I don't like. I can't think of another Malifaux player around here. I have played in the past, but I haven't played in a while.
yeah,
But yeah, just being able to buy a model and say I'm going to use it in a different cool game, like some indie games, is a lot of fun. Plus, there's a lot of times that these indie games go in many different directions, mechanics wise. It's not the same kind of like, we're just gonna, like, obviously Warhammer 40,000 is like the biggest game out there within the miniatures realm, but the way that you activate, like, it's my turn, so I go and do everything, all my guys, and then it's your turn, and then there are other games out there that are finding different ways to activate, where like I move one guy and then you move one guy and then I move one, or maybe you reach your hand into a bag full of dice and you pull one out. It's the blue one, which means that it's my turn. And then you reach in it again, pull out a blue one. And that means I get to do another
yeah,
guy. And then you reach in again and then you pull out a red one, which means it's yours. And so that kind of random activation,
absolutely, yeah.
there's
I really
more.
like that.
Yeah, and there's more like, I don't know, risks, I guess, that you can take when you're deciding to make something indie and you don't have a
Right.
whole
Well, and I
huge
think,
team's
and you also
paychecks
don't
riding on the
have,
line.
you don't have a huge lore and backlog. I mean, like Warhammer, they
It's
could
true.
easily go like, oh yeah, that's a great mechanic, but if we introduce that in our next edition, we're gonna, turn away half of our base because they're
You're
not used
exactly
to our
right, and
game working that way.
that's one of the drawbacks to some degree of indie games. Well, that's not. If you okay, one of the drawbacks to indie games is they don't frequently have the amount of lore and story that the bigger, more established miniature games have. Like, speaking of like Warhammer 40,000 and stuff like that, like that Games Workshop has their own publishing company on the side called Black Library that just makes novels about like Warhammer 40,000 and stuff, and they have
Right.
hundreds of novels. So there is an incredible amount of stuff. If you just like, if you didn't even want to play or build or paint anything for 40K, you could just be interested in reading the books and learning about the
Right. And
history and the
they have an
lore and the
RPG
stories.
now too, and
Yep, they do. And so there's a lot out there, in those types of games. Indie games rarely do that. Very frequently, indie games are pretty light on story and lore. Not all of them, but many of them are a little bit more concerned with the mechanics.
right, it's just
Um,
like a simple premise, and then they kind of go from there.
yeah, to some degree, which is fine. Like, I honestly, I'm not huge into lore. Like, I like stories in certain situations related to games, but there's other times where I'm just like, yeah, but I want to make up my own story. You know what I mean? So
Right.
I kind of like that
There's
aspect
a
too.
difference.
From
Yeah. Yeah. When I was
Yeah,
standing outside the store waiting to get in and then listening to a couple of the guys talking about 40K, and like one of
on
them was
Free
just
RPG
got in.
Day.
Yeah. He wanted to get into, there was a certain type of Marines. I apologize. I don't know these well enough. The
Sure.
Salamanders, I think.
Yep.
And he
There's a
went with
chapter
it.
of Space Marines.
Right. So then, but he had read a thing about the other ones. He liked some of their stories better. So then he's like, oh, well, now I'm gonna have to repaint them and stuff like that. I'm like, why? Why? Like I get it because the colors and the chapter markings and stuff like that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's at the same time, it's kind of like, oh, he doesn't get to play the game the exact way he wants because people will be like, actually, that's not how that happened, or that
Yeah,
person
I
doesn't
mean,
do this.
that's why, like, specifically in 40K, not to get too far off, but that's why a lot of people will do custom chapters where they'll just decide, well, I'm going to make this chapter, and you can do that. And then sometimes you decide, well, this custom chapter is a successor chapter to the salamanders, so therefore you get to use the salamander rules, but you don't have to paint them green and all that stuff. You can do, there's all kinds of different like ways you can get around that. But if you've picked like a well-known chapter and then you want to use the rules from some other chapter, you will get people who will be like, well, actually a lot, as it turns out, especially when there's so much lore and there's so much background. So again, it's a downside if you really love the lore, but it's an upside if you don't care as much about the lore, as far as
definitely a double-edged sword there. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. But production quality is also very frequently in these games, like when you're getting a book, very frequently there's never as much nice artwork as there is in, let's say, the big guys. And it's, sometimes it's hardcovers, but not always. Like my Starbreach book is hardcover and it's got some decent artwork in it, but it's not, they spend a lot of money at the big companies to pay a lot of really good artists to do stuff. And it's harder for indies to do that. So as long as that doesn't bother you too much, it's okay. And then also, like you said earlier too, with the RPGs, it's also it can be a lot harder to find other players. So, with an RPG, I feel like you can be like, hey, are you interested in playing this? And they're like, well, I've never played it before. And you're like, okay, cool. We'll sit down and we'll play it. It's a little harder to do that sometimes, I think, with miniatures. If you're playing a skirmish style game where the armies are relatively small, like in Planet 28, like generally a warband is 3 to 4 miniatures. Like it's very small.
Okay, so yeah, you could easily have enough that you can provide, but
exactly. So you could make 2 warbands, one for me and one for you, and then go into the game shop and be like, hey, you want to learn how to play this game? I've got everything that you need, and then we'll just play. Whereas if you're trying to teach somebody how to play a big army game where you need 100 models per side, most people don't want to lug around 2 armies that size. So yeah.
I don't even want to lug around 1.
Right. No, same here generally these days. Yeah. And then the last category of tabletop game is collectible card games. And honestly, I haven't been able to find much in the way of actual indie collectible card games. And I think that's partially just because of the way that collectible card games have to be done. Like, and again, there are plenty of indie card games out there, which we're kind of lumping a little. If it's not collectible, then I personally lump it into more board gaming. It's kind of board and cards. Yeah. But for collectible card games, meaning you're opening up a pack and getting random cards and you don't know what you're going to get and all that stuff, like that in and of itself is such a resource intensive sort of situation that it's not something you see indie folks do too much, except online. When I started typing in indie CCGs into Google and stuff like that, as we started doing research for this episode, everything I found was a game on Steam. So it was a PC game, so like kind of like Hearthstone, kind of like Ascension, like all those different games. There are plenty of indie companies out there who are making collectible card games, but they're all digital, which makes sense a little bit because it's way probably less like to do what like Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon do. Printing hundreds of millions of cards a year and, packaging them into separate packages and the randomness and the rarity and all that stuff. That's a huge undertaking, which is why I think you don't see it amongst your indie folks right there. Other than, like I said, digitally, then it's a totally different story. I used to joke
kind of weird to like give your friends have the ultra rare one, so you always win. Yeah.
I made this joke years ago, back when my friend Peter and I had our little kind of indie game company of ourselves, and we would do these games and stuff. I was always saying we're going to start our own CCG, and it's going to be great. It's there's going to be there's only 2 cards in the set, and one of them is really, really, really rare. So you just keep buying decks and just be like, oh, I got just all duplicates this time, because it would literally just be the same card over and over again. That'd be a way to make money, maybe. But eventually people would figure it out. After a couple of booster cases, I think they might figure it out. So, yeah, I don't know. I just, so that's just something to know. If you're interested in indie games and you're also interested in CCGs, you're going to have to go probably on the PC, because it doesn't seem like they're. And if you folks have got an indie CCG out there that you know about, please feel free to leave it in the comments below. We weren't able to find really anything.
No,
and honestly, if you've got any indie games that you like on for the other genres we've talked about above, war games, board games, RPGs, if we didn't talk about it here, definitely post it in the comments on YouTube.
Absolutely.
Because that's really, it just helps other people find out about other cool games that you might like. Because that's the thing about indies. That's probably one of the biggest things about indies is that they don't have the marketing budget. That's almost by definition, if you're an indie game company, you just kind of don't have a marketing budget, or you have very little. Now, we live in a time, obviously, where you can make podcasts for nearly for free. You can tweet, you can Instagram, you can Facebook for basically just about no money. And so, you need a computer, which costs some money, or whatever, or maybe a phone. But otherwise, there are marketing avenues for these indie folks now that there weren't, 10, 15 years ago. So that is also helpful if you're interested in indies, but there's so much that it's sometimes hard to find it amongst all the noise. So
absolutely.
But yeah. So indie RPGs, indie board games, indie miniatures, I think that they're all really cool. Indie CCGs, we're not really seeing much, but I do enjoy the indie stuff to some degree just because I still enjoy some mainstream stuff, obviously, too. I like some D&D, like some 40K.
It's always, I always get a thrill of finding something new that, maybe nobody has heard of. It's like, it's like that one band that you heard at a bar, one place that none of your friends have heard about, but that they would like it. And so you get to be the one that brings it to everybody. Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's like I was. It's the same. It's very much like music in that and I've said this before. When you start out very frequently as becoming a fan of music, you have a tendency to listen to the more mainstream stuff, and then eventually you start finding more indie stuff. And it's the same way I think with games, is that you start out with the more mainstream things, and then you eventually start to branch out and go into things that become indie. And then sometimes those indie things become popular, and then it becomes mainstream and whatever. But then it's just kind of the circle of life, as it were.
Yes.
All righty. Well, thanks again for listening to this episode of the GameFor Podcast. If you've got questions or comments and you're watching on YouTube, please leave a comment below. If you are listening via your favorite podcast player, or you just aren't into the whole YouTube comment section thing, then you can feel free to reach out to us via email at podcast@imgamefor.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And check out our website at www.imgamefor.com. That is www.iamgamefor.com. Thanks.